The frigid water rushed around Wilhelmina Frost's ankles, as the ice beneath her wagon splintered with a sickening crack that echoed across the frozen Payette River. It was February of 1883, and what had seemed like a sturdy crossing mere moments ago was now a death trap, as the heavy wagon began to sink, the frightened horses whinnying in panic as they struggled against their harnesses. Wilhelmina's heart pounded wildly in her chest, her breath forming clouds in the bitter Idaho winter air as she realized with growing horror that she was about to be dragged beneath the ice. "Hold on!" a deep voice called out from the riverbank. Through the swirling snow, she glimpsed a tall figure on horseback racing toward the breaking ice, his movements precise and determined despite the obvious danger. Frederick Zimmerman had been tracking a lost steer when he heard the splintering ice and a woman's terrified scream. Now, as he guided his horse carefully to the edge of the solid ice, he could see her wagon sinking fast, the woman's white-knuckled grip on the driver's seat the only thing keeping her from plunging into the freezing current. "Jump toward me," Frederick shouted, dismounting and cautiously making his way closer, testing each step. "The wagon's going under." Wilhelmina hesitated only for a moment, her gloved hands trembling as she calculated the distance. The ice beneath the wagon groaned ominously, water already flooding the bed where her worldly possessions sat. With one desperate prayer, she leapt toward the outstretched arms of the stranger. Frederick caught her around the waist just as the wagon broke completely through, the horses shrieking as they were pulled backward into the freezing water. He dragged her across the slippery surface, both of them sliding and scrambling until they reached solid ground. "My horses!" Wilhelmina cried, turning back toward the river where the animals thrashed against their restraints, the wagon now almost completely submerged. "Stay here," Frederick ordered, rushing back onto the treacherous ice, his lasso in hand. With expert precision, he roped first one horse, then the other, using his knife to slash through their harnesses as the wagon disappeared beneath the surface. The animals struggled to the shore, terrified but alive, as the current swallowed Wilhelmina's wagon and everything inside it. Wilhelmina sank to her knees on the snowy riverbank, her entire body shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what had just happened crashed over her. Her supplies, her clothes, the money hidden in the false bottom of her trunk, the letters from her late parents, everything gone. And she would have been gone too if not for this stranger. "Thank you," she managed through chattering teeth. "You saved my life." Frederick knelt beside her, already shrugging out of his heavy coat to wrap around her shoulders. "Frederick Zimmerman," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "We need to get you warm before the cold takes you instead of the river. My cabin's not far." "Wilhelmina Frost," she replied, the irony of her surname not lost on either of them as she struggled to stand on frozen legs. "Come on, Miss Frost," Frederick said, leading his horse over. "Boys is still a half-day's ride, and you'll freeze long before then. My place is just over that ridge." He gestured to a small rise beyond the tree line. Wilhelmina hesitated. She had left Cincinnati precisely to escape the control of men who thought they knew what was best for her. Yet here she was with little choice but to trust this stranger. "I don't mean to be forward, Mr. Zimmerman, but circumstances." She trailed off, dignity warring with survival. Frederick's weathered face softened. "Madam, all I'm offering is a fire and dry clothes. You can take my horse to town after you've warmed up if that's what you prefer." The journey to Frederick's cabin was a blur for Wilhelmina. The cold penetrated her sodden clothes, numbing her extremities despite the coat he'd wrapped around her. He'd insisted she ride his horse while he led it on foot, trudging through the snow with a grim determination. The cabin, when they reached it, was simple but solid, a testament to Frederick's skill as a builder. He quickly built up the fire in the stone hearth while Wilhelmina stood awkwardly near the door, water pooling beneath her boots. "There's clothes in that trunk," he said, gesturing to a wooden chest. "My sister's. She stayed with me last summer. They might be a bit large, but they're dry. I'll see to your horses and give you privacy." When he returned, Wilhelmina was seated before the fire in a plain brown dress, her dark hair unpinned and spread around her shoulders to dry. The firelight caught the auburn highlights in her chestnut hair, and Frederick suddenly found himself at a loss for words. "The horses?" she asked softly. "They'll be fine. Spooked but no injuries. I've got them in the lean-to with some hay." He hung his hat on a peg and busied himself with preparing coffee, acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. "Mr. Zimmerman, I don't know how to thank you," Wilhelmina began, her voice steadier now. "You risked your life for a complete stranger." Frederick shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same." "We both know that's not true," she replied quietly. "But I won't argue the point. Once the storm passes, I'll need to get to Boys. I was to start a position as a school teacher there tomorrow." "A school teacher?" Frederick raised an eyebrow, handing her a steaming mug of coffee. "Boys is lucky to have you then. They've been without one since Miss Hamilton eloped with the blacksmith last fall." A ghost of a smile crossed Wilhelmina's face. "Well, they'll have to wait a bit longer, I'm afraid. Everything I need for the position was in that wagon: my credentials, my books, my teaching materials. The river might give some of it back come spring thaw," Frederick offered, though they both knew it was unlikely. "Or maybe someone downstream will find it." Wilhelmina nodded, but her expression betrayed her doubt. She'd come west with such hopes, escaping the suffocating expectations of Cincinnati society, after refusing a marriage proposal from a man 30 years her senior. A man her uncle had insisted was her only hope after her parents' deaths left her with little more than her education and determination. "I suppose I should tell you my circumstances," she said after a moment. "I have no means to repay you for your help. Everything I had was in that wagon." Frederick waved away her concern. "I didn't help you expecting payment, Miss Frost. Nonetheless, I'm now without resources in a strange place," she continued pragmatically. "I had arranged lodging in Boys with the school board chairman's family until I could establish myself. Now I have no way to verify my identity or qualifications." Frederick considered this as he stoked the fire. "I know Judge Morris in Boys. He's on the school board. Once the weather clears, I can take you to him and vouch for what happened. A telegram to your previous employer should sort out the credentials." "That's very kind," Wilhelmina said, relief evident in her voice. "But it may be weeks before I can start teaching. I'll need to acquire new materials, and the salary wouldn't begin until I do." "You can stay here," Frederick found himself saying, surprising them both. "I mean, not here in the cabin. I have a small guest house where my sister stays when she visits. It's just a room really, but it's private and warm." Wilhelmina's eyes widened. "Mr. Zimmerman, I couldn't impose. It's no imposition," he interrupted. "I've got the space, and I could use the help around the ranch while you get back on your feet. I've been meaning to catalog the books my father left me. He was something of a collector. A school teacher would do a better job of it than I would." The offer hung between them, both aware of how unusual the arrangement would be. An unmarried woman living on the property of a bachelor rancher would certainly raise eyebrows, even in the relatively progressive territory of Idaho. "People will talk," Wilhelmina said softly, voicing both their concerns. Frederick's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "People already talk about the reclusive rancher who reads poetry to his cattle. A little more gossip won't hurt me." Despite herself, Wilhelmina laughed a warm, genuine sound that seemed to fill the small cabin and chase away some of the chill. "You read poetry to your cattle, Mr. Zimmerman." "Only the cultured ones," he replied with a straight face. "The others prefer dime novels." Their shared laughter eased some of the awkwardness between them, and as the storm raged outside, they talked by the fire like old friends rather than strangers thrown together by circumstance. Wilhelmina learned that Frederick had inherited the ranch from his father 3 years earlier, after returning from a decade working the cattle drives between Texas and Montana. He'd been born in Pennsylvania, but had moved west with his parents as a boy. His sister, now married with children of her own, lived in Boise, where her husband worked as a lawyer. In turn, Frederick discovered that Wilhelmina was the daughter of academics who had instilled in her a love of learning. She had taught at a girls' school in Cincinnati, until her parents' deaths from influenza left her in the care of an uncle who viewed her independence as an inconvenience. When he had tried to marry her off to his elderly business associate, she had applied for teaching positions across the country, accepting the first offer that came from far enough away. As night fell, Frederick insisted Wilhelmina take his bed while he slept on a pallet by the fire. Despite her protests, he was adamant. "I sleep out under the stars half the year anyway," he said, arranging blankets on the floor. "This is luxury by comparison." Lying in the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the howling wind and occasional crackle from the fire, Wilhelmina reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought her here. She had nearly died today, lost everything she owned, and yet somehow didn't feel the despair she might have expected. Perhaps it was shock, or perhaps it was the unexpected kindness of Frederick Zimmerman, with his gentle manner and unexpected sense of humor. Morning brought clear skies and a blanket of fresh snow that sparkled in the sunlight. Frederick was already up when Wilhelmina emerged from the bedroom, her borrowed dress smoothed as best she could manage without proper toiletries. "I've saddled a horse for you," he said, offering her a plate of eggs and biscuits. "I thought you might want to head into Boise, speak to Judge Morris about your situation." "You're not coming?" she asked, surprised. "Got cattle to check after that storm," he explained. "But the trail's clear enough, and Dancer knows the way. Just give her her head if you get turned around." Wilhelmina felt a flutter of nervousness. She was an adequate rider but had limited experience navigating wilderness trails. "Perhaps I should wait until you can accompany me." Frederick studied her face, reading her anxiety. "I could spare a few hours, I suppose. The cattle have survived worse than a night of snow." The ride to Boise took them through snow-covered pines and across open meadows where deer bounded away at their approach. Frederick pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area, and Wilhelmina found herself relaxing in his company. Boise in 1883 was a growing town, its streets bustling with commerce despite the winter weather. Frederick led Wilhelmina directly to the home of Judge Morris, a stately two-story building near the courthouse. The judge, a portly man with impressive mutton chops, listened gravely to their account of the accident at the river crossing. "A terrible business," he said, shaking his head. "We've lost good people at that crossing before. The ice can be treacherous even when it seems solid. You're fortunate Zimmerman here found you when he did." "Indeed," Wilhelmina agreed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "But now I find myself in a difficult position, sir. My credentials, my references, everything was lost." Judge Morris waved a hand. "We can send telegrams to verify your employment history, Miss Frost, but I'm more concerned about your immediate welfare. The school term has already begun, and the children are running wild without proper instruction." How soon could you take up your duties? I would need to acquire teaching materials, Wilhelmina explained, and suitable clothing. I've nothing but what Mr. Zimmerman kindly provided from his sister's belongings. The judge's wife, who had been quietly listening from her chair near the fire, spoke up. I'm sure the Ladies' Aid Society can help with clothing, my dear. And as for teaching materials, the school has basic supplies. Books are limited, but we've been collecting donations. There's also the matter of your lodging, Judge Morris added. You were to stay with the Hendersons, but they've taken in Mrs. Henderson's niece and her children after a bout of scarlet fever claimed her husband last month. Space is now limited. Before Wilhelmina could respond, Frederick cleared his throat. Miss Frost is welcome to use my guest house until suitable arrangements can be made. It's modest but private. Judge and Mrs. Morris exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about the propriety of such an arrangement. It's a separate building, Frederick added quickly. My sister stays there during her visits, and I've hired Miss Frost to catalog my father's book collection in exchange for the lodging, a strictly professional arrangement. Mrs. Morris's expression softened slightly. Your father did have quite the library, as I recall. Still, people will talk. With all due respect, madam, Wilhelmina said, straightening her spine, people will always find something to talk about. I would rather give them reason to discuss my teaching abilities than deny this town's children their education while I wait for more conventional accommodations. The judge chuckled appreciatively. Well said, Miss Frost. If you're willing to brave the gossip, I see no reason to delay your appointment. We can issue an advance on your salary to help you acquire necessities. That would be most helpful, Wilhelmina said gratefully. With the matter settled for the moment, Frederick excused himself to see to some ranch business while Wilhelmina remained with Mrs. Morris to discuss her immediate needs. The judge's wife proved to be a practical and efficient ally. By mid-afternoon, Wilhelmina had been introduced to several members of the Ladies' Aid Society, who promised clothing and personal items by the following day. She had also visited the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building with rows of rough-hewn desks and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. The previous teacher had left some materials a few well-worn readers, a geography text missing several pages, and a chalkboard with a crack running diagonally across one corner. It wasn't much, but it was a start. When Frederick returned to collect her, Wilhelmina was feeling more optimistic than she had since the accident. The children will expect me tomorrow morning, she told him as they rode back toward his ranch. Mrs. Morris has arranged for clothing to be delivered, and Judge Morris provided an advance that should cover basic necessities until my first proper pay. Frederick nodded, pleased at how quickly things had been arranged. And they're satisfied with your living arrangements. Wilhelmina's cheeks colored slightly. They've accepted it as a temporary solution. Mrs. Morris made it quite clear that finding more suitable accommodations should be a priority. Of course, Frederick agreed, though he felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. I'll show you to the guest house when we return. It's not much, but it should serve until something better comes along. The guest house, as Frederick had warned, was indeed small, a single room built off the side of the barn, with a separate entrance and a small window overlooking a grove of pine trees. Inside was a narrow bed, a washstand, a small table with 2 chairs, and a compact iron stove for heat. My sister insisted on having her own space when she visited, Frederick explained, lighting the stove to ward off the chill. Said my snoring kept her awake. Do you? Wilhelmina asked, then immediately blushed at the forwardness of the question. Frederick's eyes crinkled with amusement. So I've been told, though I can't verify it myself, being asleep at the time. Wilhelmina laughed, moving to inspect the small bookshelf beside the bed. It held a curious assortment Shakespeare's sonnets alongside dime novels with lurid covers, a worn Bible next to a treatise on cattle breeding. "An eclectic collection," she observed. "That's just the overflow," Frederick admitted. "The main library is in the house. My father believed in reading widely and without prejudice to subject matter. Said you never knew where wisdom might be hiding." "A philosophy I share," Wilhelmina said warmly. "I look forward to cataloging his collection." After ensuring Wilhelmina was settled with provisions for the evening, Frederick retreated to his own cabin, leaving her to rest before her first day of teaching. That night, lying in the small but comfortable bed, listening to the occasional shuffling and nickering of horses from the nearby barn, Wilhelmina tried to make sense of the drastic turn her life had taken. 2 days ago, she had been an independent woman with a plan and possessions of her own, heading toward a new beginning. Now, she was essentially starting from nothing, dependent on the kindness of strangers, particularly one tall, thoughtful rancher with kind eyes and an unexpected appreciation for literature. She should have felt more devastated by her losses. The practical part of her recognized that her situation was precarious at best. And yet, there was something liberating about having been stripped of everything but her knowledge and abilities. Perhaps, she thought as she drifted toward sleep, this was truly the fresh start she had been seeking all along. The next few weeks established a rhythm to their unusual arrangement. Wilhelmina rode to town each morning on a gentle mare Frederick had assigned for her use, taught school until mid-afternoon, and returned to catalog books for several hours before dinner. Frederick insisted she join him for the evening meal, claiming it was wasteful to maintain 2 fires for cooking, though they both recognized it was also a matter of simple human companionship. Their dinners became the highlight of Wilhelmina's days. Frederick proved to be surprisingly skilled in the kitchen, a necessity for a man living alone, he explained, and even more surprisingly well-read. Their conversations ranged from literature to philosophy to the practical challenges of ranch life and teaching. The Donovan boy insisted today that the capital of Montana Territory is Virginia City. Wilhelmina recounted one evening over a stew of rabbit and root vegetables. When I corrected him that it's Helena, he argued that his father had been there just last month. Frederick chuckled, breaking off a piece of cornbread. He's not entirely wrong. Virginia City was the capital until 1875. News travels slow in some families. How is it that a cattle rancher knows more about territorial capitals than I do? Wilhelmina asked, genuinely curious. I drove cattle to Montana for years, he reminded her. Knowing the local laws and who enforced them was a matter of practical importance. But more than that, he paused, suddenly self-conscious. More than that, Wilhelmina prompted gently. Frederick shrugged, his expression almost sheepish. I read the newspapers from front to back. Always have. My father used to say I was more interested in the doings of distant places than what was right in front of me. Is that why you traveled so much before settling here? He nodded, refilling their coffee cups. Partly. I wanted to see those places I'd read about. Turned out most weren't as interesting as the papers made them sound, except New Orleans. His eyes took on a distant look. New Orleans was everything they said and then some. I've never been further east than St. Louis, Wilhelmina admitted. Or further west than Boise, for that matter. You'll see more, Frederick said with certainty. You don't strike me as someone who stays in one place too long. The comment, innocuous as it was, touched on a truth Wilhelmina hadn't fully acknowledged to herself. She had never felt truly at home anywhere, even in Cincinnati with her parents. There had always been a restlessness in her, a sense that she was meant for something or somewhere else. "Perhaps not," she agreed softly, "though I'm finding Idaho has certain charms I hadn't anticipated." Their eyes met briefly across the table, and something unspoken passed between them before Frederick cleared his throat and stood to clear the dishes. As February gave way to March, the weather gradually warmed, though snow still blanketed the ground and ice remained on the river. Wilhelmina had settled into her teaching role, earning the respect of her students and the appreciation of their parents. The Ladies' Aid Society had provided her with a modest wardrobe, and her first proper salary had allowed her to purchase personal necessities and a few simple adornments for her small living space. The catalog of Frederick's library was progressing steadily. The collection was even more impressive than she had initially realized, nearly 1,000 volumes on subjects ranging from classical literature to modern science, history to poetry, practical manuals to philosophical treatises. Each evening after dinner, they would sit together in his small parlor, Wilhelmina making careful notations in a ledger while Frederick read aloud from whatever book had caught his interest that day. It was during one of these sessions, as Frederick's deep voice brought to life the words of Walt Whitman, that Wilhelmina realized with startling clarity that she was falling in love with him. The recognition both thrilled and terrified her. She had come west to escape the constraints of unwanted matrimony, to establish herself as an independent woman. The last thing she had sought was attachment to another man, no matter how different he might be from the elderly suitor her uncle had chosen. Frederick, for his part, found himself inventing reasons to delay Wilhelmina's departure from his property. When Judge Morris mentioned that a room had become available at the respectable boarding house in town, Frederick casually observed that spring mud would make the daily commute difficult for a lady. When Mrs. Morris suggested that perhaps the catalog project was complete enough, Frederick discovered a crate of books in the attic that had somehow escaped their attention. He wasn't ready to examine too closely why the thought of Wilhelmina leaving filled him with such disquiet. He had lived contentedly alone for years, enjoying the freedom of bachelorhood, while occasionally indulging in brief courtships during his infrequent visits to boys or larger cities. The idea of permanent attachment had never appealed to him until now. The change in their relationship came gradually, almost imperceptibly, through 100 small moments. Frederick's hand lingering as he helped Wilhelmina onto her horse, Wilhelmina bringing wildflowers from her morning ride to brighten his dinner table. The way they began to anticipate each other's thoughts in conversation, how their evening reading stretched later into the night, neither wanting to be the first to suggest retiring. Spring was truly asserting itself by early April, the snow receding to reveal tender green shoots and early wildflowers. The ice on the river had broken up weeks earlier, and Frederick suggested they ride out to see if any of Wilhelmina's possessions might have been washed ashore downstream. It was a beautiful day for a ride, the air fresh and fragrant with pine and new growth. They followed the river for several miles, scanning the banks and occasional sandbars for any sign of the wagon or its contents. "I'm being foolish," Wilhelmina said after an hour of fruitless searching. "Even if anything survived the current, it would be ruined by water." "Not necessarily," Frederick replied, guiding his horse carefully along the rocky shore. "I once found a Bible that had been in the river for a week. Pages were stuck together, but after careful drying, it was readable again." Wilhelmina smiled at his optimism. "You're kind to humor me." "It's not just kindness," he said quietly. "I know what it is to cherish the few connections to your past." Something in his tone made Wilhelmina study his profile. "You've never spoken much about your mother," she observed gently. Frederick was silent for a long moment, his eyes scanning the riverbank. "She left when I was 10, he finally said. "Went back east, said she couldn't bear another winter in this wilderness." He shrugged, a gesture that failed to disguise the old hurt. "My father never stopped hoping she'd return. Kept all her things just as she left them until the day he died." "I'm sorry," Wilhelmina said softly, understanding better now his empathy for her losses. Frederick nodded acknowledgement, then suddenly reined in his horse. "There," he said, pointing to a tangle of driftwood and debris caught in a bend of the river. "Something unnatural in that pile." They dismounted and picked their way carefully to the collection of branches and silt. Frederick began moving larger pieces aside, revealing what appeared to be a partially crushed trunk. "My writing case," Wilhelmina exclaimed, dropping to her knees beside him. "It was in the back of the wagon." Together they extracted the damaged but recognizable leather-bound case from the debris. Its brass fittings were tarnished and one corner was caved in, but the latches still held. "Let's get it to dry ground," Frederick suggested, carrying the heavy case to a sunny spot on higher ground. The latches required some persuasion to open, but eventually the case revealed its contents. Paper and notebooks swollen with water but potentially salvageable. Bottles of ink, miraculously unbroken though their labels had washed away. A small daguerreotype of Wilhelmina's parents, the image blurred but still discernible behind its protective glass. And most surprisingly, a small oilskin packet that had protected its contents from the water. "My credentials," Wilhelmina breathed, carefully untying the packet to reveal the official documents that verified her education and teaching experience. "And this," she held up a small leather pouch, opening it to reveal several gold coins. "My emergency funds. I kept them separate from my main money." Frederick smiled at her evident relief. Not such a fool's errand after all. They continued their search, finding a few more items: a dented tin that had contained tea, now filled with river water, a heavy wool shawl, muddy but intact, and most precious to Wilhelmina, a small carved wooden box containing her mother's cameo brooch and her father's pocket watch. "The watch won't run again," Frederick observed, examining the water damage to the timepiece. "But the case is fine silver. Could be melted down if you wanted to create something new from it." Wilhelmina shook her head, carefully returning the watch to its box. "Its value isn't in the silver. It's in knowing my father's hands wound it every morning for 30 years. Frederick nodded understanding, helping her gather their recovered treasures. As he secured the items on their horses, Wilhelmina stood gazing at the river that had nearly claimed her life. "It's strange," she said when Frederick joined her. 2 months ago, I thought losing my wagon meant losing everything. Now I realize how little of what matters was actually in that wagon." "What matters?" Frederick asked, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. Wilhelmina turned to look up at him, suddenly aware of how alone they were in this peaceful spot by the river. "Knowledge, memories, connections to others," she hesitated, gathering courage. "New beginnings." Frederick's expression softened as he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "Wilhelmina," he began, his voice rougher than usual. Whatever he might have said was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats. They stepped apart as a rider appeared around the river bend, one of Frederick's ranch hands, approaching at a gallop. "Mr. Zimmerman," the young man called, reining in his lathered horse. "Been looking all over for you. There's trouble at the ranch." That new bull broke through the north fence and took half the herd with him. "The men are trying to round them up, but with the spring mud, it's slow going." Frederick's expression shifted immediately to concern. "We'll head back right away," he said, helping Wilhelmina quickly mount her horse. The moment between them had passed, but something had changed nonetheless. As they rode hard for the ranch, Wilhelmina found herself wondering what Frederick had been about to say and whether she was ready to hear it. The escaped cattle created chaos that consumed the next several days. Frederick and his men worked from dawn until well past dusk, tracking and retrieving animals that had scattered across miles of muddy terrain. Wilhelmina did what she could to help, preparing meals for the exhausted cowboys and maintaining the household so Frederick could focus entirely on the crisis. It was nearly a week before the last stray was located and the damaged fences repaired. Frederick returned to the cabin late one evening, mud-splattered and bone-weary, to find Wilhelmina waiting with hot food and coffee. "You should be asleep," he said, gratefully accepting the steaming mug. "It's well past midnight." "I wanted to make sure you ate something," she replied, setting a plate of beans, bacon, and cornbread before him. "You've barely stopped to breathe this week." Frederick didn't argue, falling on the food with the appetite of a man who had been working physically demanding days. Wilhelmina sat across from him, chin propped on her hand, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "What?" he finally asked, self-consciously wiping his mouth with a napkin. "I've been thinking," she said carefully. "Judge Morris mentioned again yesterday that a room has become available at Mrs. Tillman's boarding house. It would be more appropriate for a schoolteacher than my current arrangement." Frederick set down his fork, his appetite suddenly diminished. "I see. When would you move?" "That depends," Wilhelmina said, her eyes steady on his face, "on whether I have reason to stay." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. "Wilhelmina," Frederick began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I'm not a man who finds it easy to speak about such things, but I would be deeply disappointed if you were to leave." "Disappointed," she repeated softly, a hint of challenge in her voice. Frederick took a deep breath. "More than disappointed. These past weeks, having you here, it's changed everything. The way I see this place, the way I see my future." He met her eyes directly. "The way I see myself." Wilhelmina's expression softened. "Frederick, are you trying to say you have feelings for me?" "Yes," he admitted, the single word seeming inadequate for the depth of what he felt. "I know it's fast and maybe improper given our circumstances, and I'm not asking for any promises, just don't move to Mrs. Tillman's. Not yet." Wilhelmina reached across the table, her fingers lightly touching his. "I've had offers of marriage before," she said quietly. "Arrangements made for convenience or financial security or social standing. I came west to escape such arrangements." Frederick's heart sank, but he nodded understanding. "I would never want to be an obligation." "You misunderstand me," Wilhelmina continued, her hand now fully covering his. "I came west seeking independence, yes, but I've discovered something I wasn't looking for." Her voice softened. "Something I didn't even know I wanted until I found it here with you." Frederick turned his hand to clasp hers properly, hope rising. "And what is that?" "A partnership," she said simply. "Not an arrangement where one person dominates and the other submits, but a true meeting of minds and hearts. Someone who values me for my thoughts as well as my company. Someone who sees me clearly and appreciates what he sees." "I do see you," Frederick said earnestly. "Your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, the way you adapt to challenges without complaint. The gentle way you correct your students without crushing their spirits. The fact that you can recite Wordsworth from memory but aren't too proud to learn how to mend fence posts." Wilhelmina laughed softly. "I'm still terrible at mending fence posts. But you try," he insisted. "That's what matters." They were silent for a moment, hands still joined across the table. "So you won't move to Mrs. Tillman's?" Frederick finally asked. "Not yet," Wilhelmina agreed with a small smile. But Frederick, we need to be sensible. People are already talking about our arrangement. If I stay much longer without clarification of our relationship, my reputation in town could suffer, and that would affect my standing as a teacher. Frederick nodded, understanding the delicate social position she occupied. What would you consider an appropriate clarification? Wilhelmina's cheeks colored slightly. A formal courtship would be acceptable, with the understanding that we're both free to end it if our feelings change. A courtship, Frederick repeated, testing the word. It had been many years since he'd properly courted a woman, and never one he cared for as deeply as Wilhelmina. I'd be honored, though I should warn you, I'm out of practice with the finer points of such things. As am I, Wilhelmina admitted with a smile. Perhaps we can determine our own rules as we go along. The agreement reached, they finished their meal in comfortable conversation, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. When Frederick walked Wilhelmina to her door later, he hesitated, then bent to place a gentle kiss on her cheek, their first physical expression of affection beyond handclasps. "Good night, Wilhelmina," he said softly. "Good night, Frederick," she replied, her eyes bright in the moonlight. The formal courtship of Wilhelmina Frost and Frederick Zimmerman became the subject of much interest in boys over the following weeks. Frederick made a point of escorting Wilhelmina to church each Sunday, sitting beside her during the service and joining her for the community dinner afterward. He called on her at the schoolhouse, bringing modest gifts, wildflowers, a book of poetry, once a particularly fine apple from the first harvest of his small orchard. For her part, Wilhelmina invited Frederick to school functions, proudly introducing him to parents and community members as her suitor. She mended his shirts and baked his favorite cornbread, and on one memorable occasion, organized a surprise birthday celebration that brought together friends from town and ranch hands in a rare evening of music and dancing. Their courtship was unconventional in some ways. Wilhelmina still lived on Frederick's property, though they were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, but the genuine affection between them was apparent to anyone who saw them together. And gradually, even the most traditional townspeople came to accept their relationship. As spring gave way to early summer, Wilhelmina completed the school term to great acclaim. Her students had made remarkable progress under her guidance, and the school board unanimously offered her a contract for the following year with an increase in salary. They've also offered to help secure permanent accommodations in town, Wilhelmina told Frederick one evening as they sat on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. A small house near the school is becoming available in August. Frederick was silent for a long moment, his fingers lightly tracing patterns on the back of her hand. "I've been thinking about accommodations myself," he finally said. Wilhelmina turned to look at him, a question in her eyes. "This cabin was fine for a bachelor," he continued, gesturing to the simple structure behind them, "but it's hardly suitable for more. Wilhelmina prompted softly. Frederick shifted to face her directly, taking both her hands in his. "Wilhelmina Frost, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light and purpose to days that were merely satisfactory before. I can't imagine returning to a life without you in it." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you would consider making our arrangement permanent. Will you marry me?" Though Wilhelmina had anticipated the direction of the conversation, the actual proposal still brought tears to her eyes. "Frederick," she began, her voice wavering slightly, "I need to be certain. Are you asking because you truly want me as your wife, or because it solves the practical problem of my living situation?" "I'm asking because I love you," he said simply. The practicalities are secondary. If you wanted to continue teaching and living in town, I would find a way to make that work. If you wanted to travel, I would go with you. All I know is that wherever you are is where I want to be." Wilhelmina's smile bloomed through her tears. "Then yes, Frederick Zimmerman, I will marry you, because I love you too, and there's nowhere I'd rather be than by your side." Frederick's answering smile was brilliant as he leaned forward to kiss her, a real kiss this time, tender and sweet with the promise of deeper passion. When they parted, both a little breathless, he reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. "It was my grandmother's," he explained as he opened it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect emerald. "My father gave it to me before he died, said it should go to the woman who finally captured my heart." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Frederick added softly, "It matches your eyes." Wilhelmina admired the ring, then leaned in to kiss him again, her heart full to bursting with joy and anticipation for their future together. The wedding was planned for late July, allowing time for Wilhelmina's sister to travel from Cincinnati and for the necessary preparations. Frederick began construction on an addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom and study that would give them more space while maintaining the cozy character of the original structure. Wilhelmina threw herself into creating a proper home, ordering furnishings from catalogs, planting a kitchen garden, and organizing Frederick's belongings to make room for her own. Her recovered items from the river had been carefully restored where possible, and new purchases gradually replaced what had been lost. As the wedding day approached, Wilhelmina found herself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this moment. If her wagon hadn't broken through the ice that February day, she would have continued to Boise, taken up her teaching position, and perhaps eventually settled into a comfortable but solitary life as a respectable spinster school teacher. Instead, disaster had led to the greatest happiness she had ever known. The ceremony itself was simple but joyful, held in the small church in Boise with most of the town in attendance. Wilhelmina wore a gown of ivory silk that her sister had helped her select, with her mother's restored cameo at her throat. Frederick, unaccustomed to formal attire, nevertheless cut a handsome figure in a new suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion. Their vows were traditional but spoken with evident sincerity, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Frederick's kiss was perhaps a touch more enthusiastic than strictly appropriate for a church setting, drawing chuckles and a few happy tears from the congregation. The celebration afterward, held at Judge Morris's spacious home, lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the entire county. As darkness fell, Frederick and Wilhelmina slipped away from the festivities, riding back to the ranch, their home under a canopy of stars. Their first night as husband and wife was everything Wilhelmina had shyly hoped for: tender, passionate, and filled with discoveries about each other that had been merely hinted at during their courtship. Frederick proved to be as considerate a lover as he was a partner, attentive to her inexperience and patient in his guidance. As they lay tangled together in the moonlight streaming through the window of their new bedroom, Wilhelmina traced the line of Frederick's jaw with gentle fingers. "Happy?" he murmured, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "Completely," she assured him, nestling closer. "Though I can't help thinking about how close I came to never knowing this happiness if you hadn't been riding near the river that day." Frederick tightened his arm around her. "I don't like to think about that, but perhaps it wasn't mere chance. My father used to say that some souls are meant to find each other, no matter what obstacles life puts in their way." "A romantic notion for a practical rancher," Wilhelmina observed with a smile. "He wasn't always practical," Frederick replied, his voice warm with memory. "He courted my mother by reading poetry to her by lamplight, said she fell in love with his voice before she fell in love with him." Wilhelmina laid her head on his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. "I can understand that. Your voice was one of the first things I noticed about you after you saved my life, of course." Frederick chuckled, the sound reverberating pleasantly against her ear. "And here I thought it was my rugged good looks that captured your attention." "Those didn't hurt," she admitted with a laugh. "But it was your kindness that truly won me over. The way you opened your home to a stranger without expectation of return. The respect you showed for my independence even while offering assistance." "You make me sound like some kind of saint," Frederick said, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. "I assure you, my thoughts weren't always entirely noble, especially after you started wearing my sister's blue dress." Wilhelmina propped herself up to look at him, eyebrows raised in surprise. "The blue dress, that shapeless thing," Frederick grinned, his hand settling on her waist. "It may have been shapeless, but you have shape enough to make up for it, particularly when you bent to tend the fire." "Frederick Zimmerman," Wilhelmina exclaimed in mock scandal, though she couldn't help laughing. "And here I thought you were a gentleman." "A gentleman with eyes," he corrected, pulling her down for a kiss that quickly rekindled the passion they had only recently sated. Later, drifting toward sleep in the comfortable warmth of their shared bed, Wilhelmina felt a profound contentment she had never known before. This was what she had been seeking without knowing it, not just independence or adventure, but belonging. A place and a person to call home. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. Wilhelmina continued teaching for a time, riding to town each morning and returning to the ranch each afternoon. Frederick expanded his cattle operation, hiring additional hands and improving the breeding stock, until the Z-Bar Ranch became known throughout the territory for the quality of its herds. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Frederick's father, arrived a year after their wedding, a robust baby with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. Wilhelmina reluctantly gave up classroom teaching after his birth, but continued to tutor students who needed extra assistance and to serve on the school board, helping to shape educational policy for the growing community. A daughter, Eleanor, joined the family 2 years later, followed by another son, James, the year after that. Their home expanded along with their family additional rooms, a larger kitchen, a dedicated library where the complete and meticulously cataloged collection of books was housed. The river that had nearly claimed Wilhelmina's life became a place of family recreation in summer, with swimming lessons for the children and picnics on its banks. In winter, they avoided the ice crossing, taking the longer route to town via the bridge that the county had finally constructed, partly in response to Wilhelmina's near tragedy. There were difficult times, a drought that threatened the ranch's survival, an epidemic of influenza that claimed several lives in town, including their dear friend Mrs. Morris, a fire that destroyed part of the barn and required months of rebuilding. Through it all, Frederick and Wilhelmina faced challenges as they had from the beginning as partners, each bringing their different strengths to bear on whatever problems arose. On the 10th anniversary of the day Wilhelmina's wagon had broken through the ice, Frederick surprised her with a special gift, a delicate gold pendant in the shape of a horse, with tiny emerald eyes that matched her ring. "To commemorate the day my life truly began," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. "Our lives," Wilhelmina corrected gently, turning in his arms to look up at the face she had grown to know as well as her own. A decade had added a few lines around his eyes and touches of silver at his temples, but to her, he was more handsome than ever. "You ever regret it?" Frederick asked, his expression suddenly serious. "The life you might have had if you'd made it safely to boys that day. The independence you valued so highly." Wilhelmina considered the question thoughtfully. "I don't think of it as having lost independence," she finally said. "Rather, I gained a partnership that allows me to be more fully myself than I could have been alone. And no, Frederick, I don't regret a single moment, not even the terror of falling through that ice, since it led me to you." Frederick smiled, the love in his eyes as clear and unwavering as it had been on their wedding day. "Then I propose a toast," he said, reaching for the glasses of wine they had poured earlier to mark the occasion. "To the river that brought us together, and to the life we've built on its shores." "To us," Wilhelmina agreed, touching her glass to his. "And to whatever adventures the next decade brings." As they stood together in the home they had created, surrounded by evidence of their shared life, children's drawings tacked to walls, books well worn from multiple readings, the comfortable furnishings that bore witness to a decade of family meals and quiet evenings, Wilhelmina felt the same certainty she had experienced on the day she accepted Frederick's proposal. This was where she belonged. This was home. Outside, the Payette River continued its eternal journey, flowing past their property as it had for countless years before they arrived, and would for countless years after they were gone. But for Wilhelmina Frost Zimmerman, the river would always be the beginning of her true story, the moment when disaster became destiny, and a stranger's helping hand became the love of a lifetime. 20 years after that fateful day on the ice, Frederick and Wilhelmina stood together on the porch of their ranch house, watching their eldest son Thomas ride off with his new bride, a spirited young woman from a neighboring ranch who had captured his heart much as Wilhelmina had once captured Frederick's. "Do you think they'll be happy?" Wilhelmina asked, leaning against her husband's solid shoulder. "If they're half as happy as we've been, they'll be fortunate indeed," Frederick replied, his arm secure around her waist. Their lives had continued to evolve over the years. Elinor had grown into a talented artist, whose landscapes were beginning to attract attention beyond Idaho. James, their youngest, showed a natural aptitude for ranching and had already taken over much of the day-to-day management, allowing Frederick more time for his beloved books, and for traveling with Wilhelmina, short trips to San Francisco, Denver, even once a grand journey to New Orleans to show her the city he had described so vividly when they first met. Wilhelmina herself had returned to education in a different capacity, founding a small lending library in Boise that served the growing community, and particularly focused on providing resources for children who showed academic promise but lacked means. Life had not been without sorrows. They had lost a fourth child, a daughter who lived only a few hours after her premature birth. Frederick's sister had succumbed to cancer 3 winters ago. The changing economy had brought challenges to the ranch that required adaptation and innovation. Yet through it all, their partnership had remained the bedrock of their existence, a source of strength in difficult times and joy in good ones. As the dust from Thomas's departure settled, Frederick turned to his wife with a familiar gleam in his eye. "Do you realize we have the house to ourselves for the first time in 20 years? James is staying in town for the cattle auction. Elinor is visiting her art patron in Portland." Wilhelmina laughed, the sound as delightful to Frederick now as it had been when he first heard it in his small cabin 2 decades earlier. "Why, Mr. Zimmerman, are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "Indeed I am, Mrs. Zimmerman," he confirmed, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness, if perhaps a bit less urgency, as he had on their wedding night. "I'm suggesting we enjoy some uninterrupted time together, starting with that bottle of wine I've been saving and perhaps a reading from that new poetry collection that arrived last week." "And after the poetry?" Wilhelmina asked, her green eyes still capable of making his heart skip a beat. Frederick smiled, taking her hand to lead her inside. "After the poetry, my love, we'll write our own verse, as we've been doing for 20 years. As the door closed behind them, the setting sun cast long shadows across the ranch that had witnessed their love story from its dramatic beginning to its continuing evolution. The Payette River flowed on, a constant reminder of how a moment of near tragedy had led to a lifetime of joy, proof that sometimes the most unexpected currents carry us exactly where we're meant to be.